Inside the halls of San Diego State University lies a program dedicated to storytelling and pursuing the truth. Welcome to Where You At, a podcast that takes you inside the work of alumni for the School of Journalism and Media Studies at San Diego State. Our goal is to show the success of our alumni, inspire students with the stories, and connect students and alums on a pathway to journalism success. And now, here's your host, Josh Sushan.
Coming up on this week's edition of the Where You At podcast, we are heading out to Minnesota to discuss journalism, multimedia journalism across a bunch of different platforms, what it's like to be an investigative journalist, and what it's like to be on the front lines of one of the biggest, most impactful stories of the last decade. Our guest is Megan Burks. She attended San Diego State from 2004 through 2008, and she is currently the lead producer for All Things Considered on NPR. NPR means Minnesota Public Radio. Megan, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I'm really excited. I don't remember exactly where I discovered Megan. It was probably doing some type of LinkedIn search, but when I saw her background, I thought immediately, I must get Megan on this podcast because I love the work that she's done, and then especially the work that she did on the George Floyd story, which we're going to get into. But I want to start with this, Megan. Again, I'm just really impressed with everything that you've done. When did you get the journalism bug? Tell us when and where and how journalism bit you.
It was third grade. I was really into writing, and I was lucky enough to have parents and teachers who saw that early on and connected me with, ways to continue that excitement around writing. And my mom was like, "Oh, you could be a novelist." And I was like, "No, that's not very practical. I need like a 9 to 5, Mom." And so that's where journalism came in. So it's something that I worked toward really from an early age by doing yearbooks and by doing the school newspaper in high school, and just took off from there.
Okay, so when I was in high school, I did the same thing. I was more like sports, photography, and then kind of once I cut my journalism teeth in high school with those things, I started to move on to other different, more like news type of things for my journalism time in high school. What were some of like the early moments in your yearbook or journalism in high school that really started to get you thinking like, yes, this is what it really means, and I really can do this?
Oh, it's so kind of cringy because a lot of what I wrote about in high school, like pop punk was really big, and I was like a total poser and really into pop punk and wrote about that. But I think also at the time that I was in high school, there was the Iraq War, and there were protests against that and at school. And so really kind of that first for our class, that first mobilization of students being, I want to be out front talking about this. And so covering that as a student journalist and kind of seeing your role in society at large, but at that micro scale of our students walking out to protest the Iraq War.
Well, I think that's going to be very fitting based on what happened in 2020 and what we're going to get to later on. By the time that you got to San Diego State, was it absolutely 100% journalism, or kind of where were you at mentally in terms of this is going to be my major and these are the different types of classes that I want to take in order to get to where I ultimately want to be?
It was absolutely 100% journalism. It's part of why I chose San Diego State. I was looking at UC schools. They didn't really have that journalism major. They had communications. And so I wanted to choose a CSU, and SDSU felt right for where I was at. And so, yeah, it was journalism all the way.
I'm a big believer in that certain people you meet in your life, whether it's a professor, whether it's a fellow classmate, whether it's a roommate, and you have like these key moments with these key people that you meet. Who were those types of people? What were some of those things that really helped you once you got to college?
I was involved with the University Honors Program. I was recruited into that as a freshman, and the director at that time was Jung Choi. He was a sociology professor and director of the honors program. He actually got me really more sucked into the sociology side of things. So I was a journalism major, but I was actually much more interested in and fascinated by by sociology, by those classes. Through the honors program and through those sociology classes, he talked to me and my colleagues a lot about societal systems and how they, stratify people and how they are the things behind a lot of the inequities that we see and the problems that you'd be reporting on as a journalist. And so that just got me really fired up about like service, about serving people, and how could journalism be the vehicle to do that. And then also through the honors program, I had to do a thesis. So I had to do a research project that got published or book bound, just like, a master's thesis. And so that was really kind of my first time asking a question and then doing methodical, strategic research to answer the question, which I think I approach my journalism, if I am doing an investigative type story, always with the question, right? It's not like the topic or the thing that I want the headline that I want. It's like, what is the question and how can I be creative and methodical about answering it? So it really was sociology and Dr. Choi.
Okay, so that's one of the. I want to go in a little bit deeper about this because it's one of the questions that I had was, you've done a lot of reporting on education and community health and immigration, and as a journalist, sometimes when you get assigned these stories, it's because, there's the proverbial dart and I'm throwing it against the dartboard and that's what comes up today. And sometimes it's because, nobody else in the newsroom is available to do that. And sometimes it's because you really have a passion for this story and you seek it out and you let people know these are the types of stories that I want to that I want to cover. And so based on that, with these sociology classes, how would you say that you decided that I really want to pursue these and the different people you talk to that enables you to be able to pursue these topics?
Well, I was always really interested in immigration. I grew up in San Diego, and so it was always something that was visible and something that we talked about as a family. And I was really curious about how people formed their opinions about immigration. And so that's actually what my thesis was on. It was on how talk radio helped people or contributed to people's perceptions of immigration and immigrants. And so when I got out of school, I was scrolling through Craigslist and there was this ad for somebody to do freelance reporting on an immigrant and refugee community in San Diego, which is City Heights. And I answered it and it ended up being a legit thing. And so that's really just kind of where I cut my teeth as a journalist. And my focus, my mandate was, talk to immigrants and refugees in City Heights. And from there, it kind of snowballed, where I learned the types of quality of life issues that people were concerned about, how they were trying to influence them. And, so if you're an immigrant or a refugee or a former immigrant and refugee in San Diego, you're not just worried about the border. You're worried about your kids' school. You're worried about the cost of housing. You're worried about the fact that your sidewalks are craggy and your streets are unsafe. And so that's really through that lens of immigration and refugees is kind of how that expanded out into trying to look at these systems about and how they affect people. And I think I'm really, really glad that I got sucked into the sociology world, because I do think that in journalism, we come from this legacy of like hard-nosed journalists, and they were all kind of, white men, because that's how it was for a time. And there's this idea that you need to be almost like this kind of alpha male, or you need to be aggressive and confident. And there's this adage of giving voice to the voiceless, which I actually think is like a very ego-driven statement. I'm going to give voice. And I think sociology, when I got sucked into that, it turned it around. It was like, no, people are voicing themselves. And, of course, we can give a platform that they haven't had before, but really, what is my role? What tools do I have? And where do I fit into this larger society or community? So I like to think that it took more of the ego out of the way that I do the work. And I'm focused more on like, okay, well, what tools do I bring to the table? What tools do the people I'm talking to already bring to the table? And how do those match and lift this issue up even higher?
Okay, so when you first start off on this story, do you just start walking the streets with a pen and paper in hand and a recorder and just start looking for people? Where do you even begin to find the immigrants and develop the trust in order to get them to talk to you?
I did walk the streets, and that wasn't successful at all.
Okay.
You need to kind of make inroads with community service organizations that have already built the trust. So early on in my career, a lot of my time was spent talking with community organizers, with people who ran programs who were serving the population I wanted to connect with. And they would, I had to build trust with them first. And then they would connect me with a client, somebody who was, more of a resident with firsthand experience. And then you have to build trust with that person. And eventually, as you get your reps in, and if you're doing it right, you'll start where the person, the nonprofit person will always want to be in the room to make sure that you're not like being insensitive or misinformed. And then eventually you'll see them, the next interview, they won't be in the room. And then the next interview, they won't make the connection. They'll just give you the phone number. And so it's building trust with the people who already have those people's trust, the source's trust. Then it just kind of snowballs from there.
Whenever possible, I want to give our students as many just different things to think about. And so when it comes to trust, that's a key word that I think about with journalism. And even just like on a micro scale, do you think about what clothes am I going to wear today? Like how much makeup I'm going to wear, or what, clothing I'm going to wear, or different other types of things what you think about before you go in to meet someone who you haven't met and you're trying to tell their story?
It definitely, it changes based on who I'm talking to and what this assignment is. And so if I'm talking to an elected official, I might dress a little bit more business casual. If I am going out into the field and I just want to meet people and strike up conversation, I may not dress as business casual because I want to not be intimidating. And, a lot of times if you're working in disenfranchised communities, journalists are seen just as officials and cops are seen, And so I try to be cognizant of that and maybe dress a little bit more casual. But also if I am talking to a mom who is trying to get a policy enacted at school, she's not an elected official, but if she's inviting me into her house, I might then bring the business casual because I want her to know, like, I respect this. I take this seriously. She isn't just a mom. She's a source. So I definitely think about what I wear.
Yeah. And then, for a lot of people who don't get interviewed on a regular basis, it can be somewhat intimidating when someone comes in with a camera, or if they come in with a lot of like radio equipment with microphones and things like that. And I remember when I was first getting started in journalism, some older journalists told me, you have to know when to literally have your notebook in your back pocket and just talk to people, and when to literally bring it out. And both from a literal standpoint and a figurative standpoint, what has been your strategy for, especially as we're doing multimedia with a lot of different things, of when to just show up and when to let them see recorders and notepads and pens and recording devices?
I always try to pre-interview somebody. I mean, you don't always get the time, right? Sometimes you get an assignment and you just have to make it work that day. But for stories where I do have the time, I'm usually talking to the person in advance. So I know what they bring to the story, what role they're going to play in the story. And I take that opportunity to also let them ask me questions and also tell them kind of, okay, when we do this interview, this is how it's going to roll out. It's not going to be live. We can both mess up and we can both retake it. And I'm going to have a videographer with me. And so I just try to talk them through the nuts and bolts of what's going to happen so that they can feel prepared. I also even will, if I do pull out my reporter's notebook and start writing, I'll say, I'm just writing this down for notes. I'm not quoting you right now. Or, I make sure that they know when they're going to be quoted. And if I try to put myself in their shoes, and if I'm doing something where they might be like, wait a minute, what is she doing that for? I try to explain that without them having to ask.
Yeah, I know that. So Megan doesn't know too much about my background, but I was a newspaper reporter for 10 years before I switched over. And now I work in this very fun, silly world of minor league baseball. But within my days of being a Major League Baseball newspaper reporter, there would be times that I'm talking to somebody and literally the notebook is in my back pocket. And I might even say to them, wow, this is really interesting. Do you mind if I take notes on this? I think this would make a good story. And I feel like that was a way of establishing trust with someone so that they knew, okay, we were just talking like two people. And now, okay, here's this device that's coming out of my pocket that I'm pressing record on. And if they say, no, this was off the record, then okay, that's fine. I don't want to burn that source. But if they go, oh yeah, that's fine, absolutely. And then start to get into more of the details. And I think that I felt like that was a way of building trust, of letting someone know they're not always on the record with me every single second that we're talking. But now I'm holding pen to paper with a recorder. Now, okay, we're talking on record, so that they can kind of differentiate themselves.
Yeah, I even had, a situation like that yesterday. I was interviewing somebody, and, this is for a story that is going to be a long-term story. And I was just kind of getting a baseline interview done. We knew that we probably didn't want to use the name of a minor, and she accidentally said the name of the minor and said, like, oh gosh, oh shoot, I can't believe I did that. And I was like, no, it's totally okay. I have your back. Like, I am going, anything that goes out on air is going to be triple checked. And my intent is not to hurt you in any way. And then, I also even kind of told her, here are the other people I think I'm going to talk to. Here's like how I feel like the story is going to be shaped in the end. But of course that could change. And then I also, I ask hard questions that are like devil's advocate questions. And I tell them, hey, I'm not trying to judge you, but I think people listening to this might think, hey, well, what about this? So what would you say to them? So I try to talk them through why I'm asking the questions that I'm asking to. That's a really good
strategy. I shouldn't even use the word strategy. I think that's just being fair. And I think that's a really effective way of communicating with your source and letting them know this is why I'm asking the questions, so that you can tell that story better that way.
Yeah, I think a lot of times young journalists, I see this with young journalists in our newsroom and interns, they feel like it's rude to ask the devil's advocate question. And also, they are coming into the space with this idea of wanting to give voice to the voiceless. And here's the person who's quote unquote voiceless. And so we need to put them on a pedestal and treat them kindly. And I think what people don't realize is that giving them the opportunity to respond to the naysayers is treating them kindly. You're not asking that. You're giving them the opportunity to respond to somebody who will be asking that.
Ooh, that's really good. That's really good too. Okay, let's kind of skip ahead. You grew up in San Diego. You went to San Diego State, America's finest city, and then you moved to Minnesota. Tell us what goes into the decision to move to Minnesota. What was this like for you from a career standpoint? Was it an easy choice? Was it a hard choice? What was it like to move to Minnesota?
Well, I had kind of hit a wall at KPBS. I worked at KPBS, and it's a smaller station, and so there are only so many jobs to go around. And there were a couple people who did great work and who had a bit more tenure than me. And so I saw them get at the roles that I had my eyes on and thought, well, gosh, they're pretty far from retirement. I would be waiting 50 years before I got into that job. So what am I going to do? And then the other really big decision factor was it's just so expensive to live in San Diego. And there's no, my partner and I both worked in nonprofits, and we didn't have family money to help us with a down payment on a house. And so we were just looking for some place where we could afford to live, buy a house, have a good standard of living for organizations that had some more growth potential. And so we kind of made a list of cities that were interesting to us. We visited Minneapolis on a beautiful fall day. What we didn't realize is that it was the last day of the season, and that's why everybody was living it up. We're just like, oh my gosh, it must be like this every day. This is but no, they were living it up because the snow was going to fall the minute we got on the plane back to San Diego. But we really kind of fell for it. And NPR is connected to American Public Media, which puts out Marketplace and actually owns KPCC in Pasadena. So it just seemed like an organization with a lot of growth potential. So I applied for a producer job. We moved out here. We landed here on Valentine's Day, 2019. We just missed the polar vortex, and we settled into our apartment in St. Paul. And I immediately got the worst allergies of my life because of all of the radiators kicking up dust. I had never been in a home with radiators before. But yeah, winter out here is real. It's real hard. The first 2 years I was pretty enamored with it. It's beautiful. Last year was now we're starting to finally get our senses and talk about how we're going to get to a warmer place in February for vacation.
So you move in 2019 and you have allergies, and basically a year later is when COVID hits, and we're completely shut down as a country, but newsrooms still have to operate. And we're going to get to May 25th here in a moment. But first, let's talk about, roughly late February to early March into May. Describe what it's like in a somewhat fairly new place and trying to deliver news as our world is shut down and we just don't have access to people like we did.
I was lucky in that I work on a show. So part of the key part of my job is being a part of a team. So, we did have to work remotely for a time. Although we had to have 3 people in the building for a while. So we had to have an engineer to get the show out on the air, a producer to help that engineer, and our host. Eventually, our host went remote. They built him a home studio. And so it was just an engineer and a producer in the building alone, pretty much putting out the show with the host at home. But we were all in constant contact because we were putting out this product together. So it didn't feel really isolating. And it was one of those moments where your role is so clear. Our governor had a daily COVID briefing, and we put that on the air every single day. And it was just, new information every day. And our ratings for it were like off the charts. I was surprised because it was a dry press conference every day, but people were so scared that they tuned into this hour-long broadcast of the governor sharing information. And so just like that public safety role became incredibly clear. And there was no question about what we were doing with our days. We didn't have that kind of sputtering or that doubt or, the directive was clear. And that actually kind of came to bite me in the end because everybody spent their pandemics figuring out what mattered to them and figuring out work-life balance, and came back with this new idea about who they were as a person. And they were all coming back bright-eyed. And I was just beleaguered, and because I had been focused head down the whole pandemic. And then I was like, wait, I didn't do the same soul searching as all of you. Well, so it was good. My role was clear, but now I'm catching up.
Well, it was also hard for you to do that soul searching because of the next story that I want to get into. And it began on May 25th of 2020. That is the day that George Floyd was killed on the streets. When did you first start to hear what had happened? Where were you? Take us through the initial stages of covering the story.
I think when it happened, we were flying back home from San Diego. It was this thing where everybody woke up in the morning and saw this devastating video and this sort of calm, everybody knew something big was going to happen. And we were all just bracing ourselves. And for us, it was we got off, we had been in a different city, got off the plane, went to bed, woke up, and we're just so disoriented. We had been in San Diego because my partner's dad had died. And so it was just a total mind melting experience. And I think, it's as a producer, much of my role at that time was to be in the control room, making sure that all of the important work that the reporters were doing on the ground was getting out to our audience. And so it was just like COVID. It was, okay, game on. My role is clear. Get in the control room and help keep people informed, do what I can to keep my colleagues safe. And so, so we were trying to get important information on the air about, what had happened, how people were reacting, how people were going to be held accountable, but also because there were riots about where the fires were and what people were doing as fire suppression tactics to protect their homes. And, I was in the control room. I lived on a street that becomes Lake Street, where all the riots were happening, and everybody was marching towards St. Paul, and it seemed like they were going to cross the bridge, and then it would be my street. And I lived right between the governor's mansion and the state capitol. And I thought, if they do come into St. Paul, they're going to pass by our house. And I'm here in the control room and I need to keep the public informed, but I also need to make sure that my boyfriend is informed and can keep him and our dog safe and our neighbors safe. So I was playing this sort of dual role because we were really truly like the information holders. We were the ones with people on the ground reporting back in this really chaotic scene. So it was really intense. In addition, so we're playing that dual role of like informing our loved ones and our colleagues and also informing the public. And we were also, we were just thinking like, we need to get like gas masks to people and goggles to people and PPE and like food. And so I was also trying to help our newsroom coordinator figure out like where could we set that stuff up. So we actually like had a couple of people with homes in the area volunteer to open their homes to our colleagues so that they can come by, get some food, wash out their eyes, pick up some goggles, that sort of thing.
When you are a local news organization and it becomes a national story where everybody in the country, if not in the world, descend upon your city, what are the advantages and what are the disadvantages as a local media outlet when it becomes this massive national story?
To some extent, it helps with that, like prioritizing. Again, your role, right? So in the early days, it's national NPR, National Public Radio, calling us to get reports, or it's other news organizations calling us to be like, what the heck is going on? And then when they come, you can kind of leave the bigger cultural story to them for a little bit while you focus on the public safety story. And then you can pick up the cultural story when there's a little bit more bandwidth. And the cultural story is absolutely important and, more important than the public safety story in the long run. But I think journalists need to be comfortable getting outside of this idea of competition and think more about everyone plays their part. And so I think as a local journalist, the part that we could focus on was the public safety information. It does get kind of frustrating because then people don't want to talk to you. They want to talk to the national outlet. And also national outlets may come in and not quite know like your community culture, and they may do something seen as insensitive. And then now all journalists are seen as responding to this incident in that way. The other thing I wanted to say about national coverage of this, to me, the hardest part of it, so national media comes in and that can be positive, but then it can also introduce some problems like creating this image of all journalists as being this one thing. But what was really hard was to see it take off on social media with all the misinformation, and to see family and friends out of state posting what was happening as if they knew, and me being like, wait a minute, hi, I'm your niece, your trusted niece. And that's not what was happening. That is not what was happening. But politics were so inflamed at that time that it didn't matter. Like I was part of big media getting the story wrong, or, part of liberal media getting the story wrong. And on the ground fact was just thrown out the window. And that's my bread and butter, right? On the ground fact. So that was what made that coverage really hard.
When you're fighting, when people think that you're doing misinformation and now you're trying to not just tell the story, but try to prove to people that you're telling the story, that's where it seems like your head wants to explode as a journalist. You're like, no, really, this is really accurate news here.
Yeah. I think we constantly we're still talking about how do we maintain trust that we do have in multiple communities so that not everybody has their own personalized source of information. But in the moment, you do have to keep an eye out for your mental health. And so I think around that time, this was also during the Trump years where there was just this new headline every 3 hours. I decided I'm going to get outraged about one thing a day. I choose one thing a day and I'll let people get outraged about the other things. Like there's plenty of outrage to go around.
I want to go to another part of covering a major story like this, because you mentioned getting gas masks and you mentioned having a place where reporters could go to get something to eat, to get something to drink. And People were just angry, and sometimes you don't know who exactly you're angry at, so you just lash out at everyone. Just this idea of how you and your fellow journalists protect yourself, but still make sure that you're there to get the story and tell the story properly. But yet at the same time, there's people that might either accidentally throw something at you or absolutely purposefully throw something at you or get mad at you, and how that you do that balancing line as a journalist.
One thing that we talked about, I think it goes again back to being okay with letting go of competition, right? Like there are a lot of type A journalists, people who are journalists. That's just kind of who we are. And I think you need to be okay letting go of competition. You don't need to be on the actual front lines. You can be far back and at an elevated position observing. And so we talked about that a lot as a newsroom. We did know that it was really, really important for us to see up close how police were treating protesters so that we could hold them accountable. What we did when it got, particularly dangerous is we said, okay, there are so many cameras. Everybody has their cell phone out. This is being documented across the board. It is being documented from many different angles. And so we're going to be okay with not having our people at the very, very front lines getting hit by rubber bullets and tear gassed. And so, but we still kept that accountability mandate by making sure that we were monitoring. We were just monitoring from a safer place after a certain time.
So literally, George Floyd said, "I can't breathe." Figuratively, for you and your colleagues, when did you feel like you could take a step back from the story and start to figuratively exhale and get back into somewhat of a whatever normal news routine there is?
Honestly, it wasn't normal, and it hasn't been normal, but we didn't exhale as journalists or as, the community of Minneapolis, St. Paul, until Chauvin was convicted. Because leading up to the conviction, there were still protests. There was still so much national scrutiny and attention to what was happening here. My pharmacy and post office just reopened. So, there were these big gashes through our community just hanging out there. When the trial was going to happen, there was National Guard here. There were big tanks rumbling down our streets at the corner when you were going to the grocery store for weeks at a time. And so nothing was normal. There was no exhale until I was outside of the government center, talking to people as they were waiting for the verdict. And somebody had this PA system, and we heard, because we were carrying it live on air, and I heard through this kind of PA, this really kind of busted PA system, "Guilty, guilty, guilty." And then everybody around me was like, "Guilty, guilty, guilty." And that was the collective exhale. And from there, people rolled in barbecues and started cooking for each other. And people, poured into the streets and put their cars into the street and put big PA systems on the back of them and started DJing and playing music. And that was the first time we took a breath since May 25th, 2020.
It's over 3 years now, but the reporting still continues. I've read and watched in the recent days a lot of those things. I really enjoyed the one where the family gathers in the park to discuss. Tell the audience in more detail the stories that continue to this day, 3 years later, and the stories that will continue in the years that follow.
So the community is still there, and they're still, asking for accountability and community investment. We just had the Department of Justice bring down a consent decree, and so we're watching how the Minneapolis Police Department is going to respond to that, and if real, reform is going to come. Sometime every story we do, everything about, nonprofit giving or about education, there's always a question in there of how has this changed since George Floyd? And sometimes we ask ourselves, when do we stop asking that question? When can we? And it doesn't feel like that time is anytime soon. I mean, it just has had such a reverberation. So it's really informing every beat and, everything that we do still.
My next question is I almost feel a little bit awkward in asking this because, look, your job as a journalist is to tell the stories that people want to hear about, that they want to read, that they want to listen to. But you can't go constantly just chasing clicks and ratings and things like that. So whenever you do follow-up stories about the George Floyd story, what do you notice in terms of the interest, the interaction, and how much of an appetite these stories continue to have 3 years later?
I definitely feel like people want to move on. White listeners probably feel ready to move on. I think communities of color, to some extent, also want to move on. I mean, I've talked to people who are just like, I need to take care of my mental health, and I can't keep following these accounts on Instagram that like bring up this trauma every single time. Like I'm allowing myself some cat videos, you know.
Right.
But also communities of color are like, okay, there's still so much work to do. I don't know how we navigate that. I think, I mean, one thing we do know is like the story of police accountability is incredibly, incredibly important, and clicks don't matter on that. I mean, this is the biggest story of our careers, and it is still unfolding as the DOJ does its work, and as the new police chief comes in and tries to change things. And so I think as journalists, again, being okay with letting go of competition, the things that matter to the community, maybe like people don't want to think about it right now, but it's part of writing history. You still go all in on those. But you also allow yourself to be human and allow listeners to be human and give them that healthy mix of stories. And so you give them, the accountability stories, the sort of fruits and vegetables, but you also give them, fun stories about, I mean, when people became enamored here in Minnesota, we name our snowplows. There's competitions every year to name the snowplow. And so they named one Blizzo, and we let that Blizzo story ride all winter because, people need to smile.
Yeah.
And it's our role to help provide that too.
You use the phrase biggest story of our lives. I don't think anyone is truly ever ready and prepared for the biggest story of their life. But for the next journalist who might move to another city and then a year and a half later start covering the biggest story of his or her life, what type of advice can you give journalists so that you are somewhat prepared for the biggest story of your life?
I think it's important to take your ego out of it. Don't worry about what awards you're going to win. Don't worry about what kind of writing people are going to associate with your byline. What role can you play in your community at that time? What tools do you have that other people in your community don't have? So we had a radio station and the ability to get, COVID-19 briefings on air, or we had a radio station and the ability to get key public safety information out there to the public. Focus on what role you can play in your community. You don't have to do it all. And, look at your colleagues and see what role they're playing and how you can support them in that. Can you help them set up a pickup spot for gas masks and a snack? Take the ego out of it. If you are doing the work for the people, the awards will come. And if they don't, who cares?
All right, Megan, I know this is a really heavy, intense topic. Is there anything else related to this that I haven't asked that you want to add before we move on to the final part of this podcast?
Well, I think that we talked a little bit about building trust, and I wanted to share an experience I had, covering George Floyd afterward, and that community and that family in the park that you mentioned. Mm-hmm. That came because I realized that there was something going on at this intersection that we weren't covering because we were so focused, necessarily on the fallout for the police and police accountability and the trials and these trial dates and everything. And so I said, well, what role can I play? I can go document what's happening at this square. And I went out there just to kind of talk to people, no reporter's notebook, no camera, no nothing, to say, here's what I'm thinking. And people were skeptical of me. I said, well, why? Like tell me about it. And I actually ended up spending, an hour in somebody's backyard talking with a group of people about why working with me gave them pause. And they said, we don't want you to drop in and drop out, just like the national media did. And I said, I will not. I see this as a 6-month-long project. I will be here. You will see my face time and time again. And then they said, what benefit does this give us? You will get your byline and maybe an award, but, I don't see our people working at your station. I don't see our people working in media. And so, I think it's important to have that conversation and to be open to doing journalism in a different way. Hold on to your ethics, hold on to your professionalism, follow your rules, don't get fired. But is there something you can do? And so what we landed on is that we would train high school students in the neighborhood to tell some of these stories so that they could get career development. They could be the ones telling the story alongside me and my colleagues. And that it ended up being a really cool project. It did get a national award, and it came about because the community challenged me to think about differently. And I said, yeah, let's do it differently. Allow yourself to be challenged.
That's a great story on so many levels. And I think that shows like, okay, this is why you can trust me, or this is where I'm proving it. And plus we're creating new journalists, right? And we're teaching them how to tell correct stories and using their expertise, even if they're way younger than us, because they live there. That's really neat. I love that. Well done, Megan.
Thanks.
Okay, we like to finish the podcast by bragging about someone from San Diego State so that we can tell more stories about our alums and what they're doing. So if you have somebody ready, Megan, go ahead. If not, then I'll go first.
I want to shout out Melissa Peterman. She was a couple of years ahead of me in the honors program when I was a freshman, and she also got sucked into sociology and hanging out with Dr. Choi and learning all about systems and how we could maybe one day dismantle them. And she's currently trying to do that work in the space of housing for homeless people. So she's doing really great work.
All right. Excellent. Way to go, Melissa. Okay. For my alum that I want to give a shout out to, I always try to find someone who is somewhat related to the guest. And this is someone I found on LinkedIn. Her name is Leslie Kirk. And Leslie initially worked in San Diego, KGET, and then also Fox 6 News. And then she left and she worked for the County of San Diego. And now she is the owner of Digital Justice Films. And I'm just going to read from her bio on LinkedIn so that I make sure that I get this correct. Her own film company, Digital Justice Films. She produces and writes investigative documentaries that highlight injustices in society, ranging from sex predators to nursing home abuse, focusing on vulnerable positions. Again, her name is Leslie Kirk, and she is the owner of Digital Justice Films. Way to go, Leslie.
Very cool.
Yeah. All right, Megan, I appreciate your time so much and your willingness to share what it was an extremely intense story, your entire career. I'm proud to get to meet you, proud of what you're doing to represent San Diego State. Keep it up. Way to go.
Thank you.
Once again, that is Megan Burks. She's the lead producer for All Things Considered on NPR News. My name is Josh Sushan. I'm your host. Thanks for listening, and we will talk to you again next week.
Thanks for listening to the Where Ya At podcast. This is Devin Watley from the class of 2021. Thanks to Martine Marine for creating the music you're hearing right now, and Alex Piscatelli for her work on the podcast name and artwork on social media. And a reminder to SDSU alums, we really want to know where you at. Tell us about your career. Get involved in the school. There's many ways you can do this, from donating your time or money, mentoring students, to even speaking in classrooms, in person or on Zoom. Your work can help us grow the program and create more opportunities for our students to succeed. Again, thanks for listening. Subscribe to this podcast. Tell your friends. Recommend us a future guest. And go Aztecs.